We're at Voxxed Days Athens, and I'm joined by Simon Brown, who gave the keynote about software architecture. And now you kind of stumped me because I think you answered every question that I possibly had in the keynote. So I'm going to ask you something that you probably get asked all the time, which is, do you think, and I know what the answer is, do you think there's a disconnect between architecture, as in software architecture is aspirational, rather than something that we put into practice?
Yeah, I think if you go back like 20 years, we used to do a lot of big upfront design, and that's when architecture was firmly rooted in processes. But it was that horrible big ivory tower, horrible approach to architecture, and then Agile came around, and that sort of got dropped.
Yeah. And
something I've noticed over the past sort of 10 or 15 years is that teams want to. You're right. They're kind of aspiring to do more architecture, but maybe they don't know how, and they realise that going back to the stuff we did 20 years ago is not the way to do it. So there's like a pendulum swing.
I suppose like every pattern in software development, then maybe it'll come back in vogue.
Right, it's just a complete cycle, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I thought the points were really good. You showed some images of bad software architecture, and then I was really embarrassed because I showed you a picture of what I'd done about 2 days ago, which mimicked that bad architecture.
Right, but I've also done that in the past.
Okay, so you're not without your sins. So then towards the end you talked about modelling.
Yeah.
So for anybody wondering about software architecture, this is the idea that you really, I'm not sure what the right word is, really tie in your actual software development with the diagrams by making them connected and interdependent somehow.
Yes. Yeah, so if you look at a code base, it's just a collection of text files. But when we're having like an architecture discussion, or we're at a whiteboard describing how to add a new feature or a user story or whatever, we don't often use the words class and interface. We talk about modules or layers or services or components, and it's that mapping between these abstract concepts and the code that's important, and that's the whole kind of benefit of modeling. It's about treating your code base not as a collection of flat text files, but as a collection of things.
Living, breathing.
Ideally living, breathing. Again, if you look back years and years ago, we used to do this whole big upfront design, and we used to create models of our software system with tools like Rational Rows, but it was all very upfront focus, so upfront modeling, and then you'd either press a button to magically get code, which is a horrible concept, or you would just keep that model as a separate artifact to your code, and that connection was missing.
So you mentioned in the keynote your open source project, which is called Structurizr. Is that a move on your part to connect agile processes with software architecture?
Kind of. I mean, I don't really picture it as an agile tool, but if you look at a lot of the tools people are currently using to create architecture diagrams, predominantly it's either whiteboards, and whiteboards, low barrier to entry. Everybody has one in their office. They just grab a whiteboard marker and start drawing pictures. So it's very easy for people to use. Or there's a whole bunch of people using text-based tooling now. So things like web sequence diagrams, plant UML, and these sorts of things. And when you need a quick diagram within your Confluence page or documentation, you just put some text together, textual definition. You press some buttons, and you get an automatically generated diagram. And it's a really appealing thing from a developer perspective because it's text. We work with text every day. We have lots of tooling to support text, and we can check text in. And it's very easy to integrate these tools into the build chain. So there's something you can find on Twitter called Doc Toolchain, and it's about assembling a collection of lightweight tooling that lets you create these kind of lightweight artifacts. And so what I'm trying to do with Structurizr is really piggyback off that text-based movement. So we're not taking people out of their development IDs into these big, complex, bloated modeling tools, but we're kind of using their additional knowledge. We're not having to teach people these horrendously complex architecture description languages. So yeah, it's about creating the text, staying in the code, and creating some lightweight tooling, and making it as easy as possible to keep the diagrams up to date when the code changes. And I think that's that. To come back to your actual question, I think that's the interesting thing here. So the reason I put this tooling together is because I wanted a set of tooling that I could use to A, create architecture artifacts easily, and B, I wanted to do it with a minimum amount of effort. So when I'm changing my own code base, I want to have a bunch of diagrams kept up to date as far as they can.
Yeah. And do you, so some people, we were talking about comments in the code earlier, and read a few bits and pieces from, say, the Clean Code book. You shouldn't need comments, your code should speak for yourself. Do you ever feel like that about architecture diagrams? Is your ideal world one where we need none because the code speaks for itself, or do you think that's actually not possible?
I don't think that's possible. I mean, I'm definitely in favour of clean code and refactoring code and short intentful methods and variable names that are appropriate and all that sort of stuff. But the code doesn't tell the whole story. That's the fundamental problem here. So given any system, any code base, the codes can't tell you who uses the system, often how they use it. Code can't tell you how it's deployed or operated or supported. And of course, the big thing that's missing from an architecture perspective, if you go back to Grady Booch's definition of architecture is about significant decisions. And those significant decisions and the intent and the design rationale is often missing from the code. So it's that layer on top of the code. So when I did my talk, I talked about the travel guidebook.
Yeah.
So you have a set of maps that are your model of your code base, and then the travel guidebook is that layer of supplementary documentation on top that tells you the practical information, the history, the culture, the decisions.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.